Hey guys, Peter here to tell you about the debut record from Vomit 4th, Seething Malevolence, out July 8th on Century Media Records. The album has 11 tracks, 29 minutes in length, and they are an American brutal death metal band. Now, a record like this doesn't need much as far as the design, as far as the structure is concerned, but in my humble opinion, it needs two things: a start and a finish. Because otherwise, everything just becomes very chaotic. It becomes nearly impossible to tell the forest from the trees. Everything feels all mangled as one, and the songs start to lose a little bit of its diversity and becomes more about the elements that they have in common versus the elements that actually separate one from the other. The best way to start to create some shapes, to start to create a sense of progression, a sense of fluidity, is by introducing an intro that gives you the start of the record and also allows you to better understand what you're getting yourself into, and then a song that works as an outro at the end of the record that gives you a sense of finality to that same experience. This record has both elements. I love the intro because it does what it's supposed to do, introduces the album, it lets you tippy-toe into these waters and better understand what's coming next and better engage yourself with what's coming next. And then the closing track really works as an outro. It feels like it gives a sense of finality to the album. It allows you to understand that the experience that you've just been through has ended. And everything else in between could be chaotic. It could be moving all over the place with different starting points, with different finish points. That's completely fine. I don't care that much about how much mobility or how much chaos exists within the record, as long as the bookends of the album are there to keep the record somewhat under control. I'm totally fine with everything else around it, and this album has that ability. As far as the soundscape is concerned, this album is brutal. Not just brutal in the sound, but brutal in the production. The production feels very sloppy at times. And I understand that when you have sound like this, when you want to create this sort of rustic, for lack of a better word, experience, when you want to create this sound that feels rugged, that feels rough, that feels unpolished, going with that style of production perhaps enhances that experience. It takes you to the garage, it takes you to the studio where everything was created, and you feel like you're part of that creation. If that is the idea behind the soundscape on this album, or what they're trying to put forward, they definitely achieved it. In my opinion, the album feels too sloppy. I don't mind a brutal death metal album that has those kind of elements, that feels dirty, that feels unpolished. It should feel that way anyhow, but this record, production-wise, is a little bit below what my expectations were coming in. And I think there's room for improvement and there's room for growth in that perspective. You could still be brutal, you could still have all of the other elements that you're trying to achieve with something better behind it, with better production that allows the songs to have a more defined pattern, to have a more defined outlook, and not take anything away from the brutality that you're trying to create, from the brutality that you're trying to instill in the listener with every single song. Now, within that sound, within that experience that this record offers, you see not only brutal death metal sounds or brutal death metal elements, but you're also going to see some grindcore elements peeking out here and there that add to the flavor that this album offers, because it's not a mundane sounding album. When you look at how these songs are put together, when you look at the sound experience that every single track gives you, this album actually has quite a bit of diversity. A lot more than I was expecting coming in, and a lot more than what I first felt at first listen, at first glance. The more that I heard this album, the more I was able to peel and understand exactly what was happening behind the scenes. And I think you could understand it even better, even quicker, if that production was slightly better, in order to better define what are the influences, what are they trying to do, and not necessarily create this sense of ruggedness, this sense of dirt that just permeates across each and every single song, sometimes even in the transitions from track to track. It just makes it feel unfinished at times. Now, within that soundscape, you have two main pillars: the drums and the guitars. The guitars on this album actually sound really good. I like the chunkiness that they have. I like the dirt that they have on the edges. I like how they drive the song, how more penetrating they are sometimes, a little bit slower, more methodic other times. They dictate pretty much the movement of their album, and they dictate the movement of the individual songs. A lot of the diversity that I was mentioning earlier, it's really due to the guitars, how they sound and how they come across track in and track out. So the overall guitar experience was something that I enjoyed, was something that I looked forward to with each and every single song, because it always took me on a slightly different path. even though the direction was always exactly the same. The same cannot be said for the drums. I felt like the drums lacked a little bit of shape, not power, because power they do have consistently from start to finish, but the drums at times didn't feel like they had the right shapes around it. They didn't feel like they were being used in order to not just ground the tracks, but box the songs in and give them a sense of comfort, filling in all the empty gaps in order for the tracks to feel more complete, in order for the tracks to feel more robust. The production behind it doesn't help either. It doesn't help the overall sound experience, like I mentioned earlier, but it definitely doesn't help the drum sound. The drum sound at times feels a little bit static, and I know that's what they were going for. I understand that that's the style and the approach that they wanted, but it gives a very uneasy experience for the listener. You're not quite sure where this album is going drum-wise because of it. It has a negative impact even on how you perceive the guitars, because sometimes you can almost feel the two elements clashing with one another. The sounds are not perfectly blending, they're just completely colliding, and that creates a sense of unease as far as the listener and as far as the way you're going to process and digest those specific tracks. Now, vocally, the album is really what I would expect from a brutal death metal record with some grindcore elements. An album that stays very consistent, that has a nice range vocally from the bottom growls to the upper screams. I like that stretch because it allows the tracks to have a little bit more of a footprint, because musically they feel at times very narrow. These tracks are not long. I mean, the album is 29 minutes. There's 11 songs, so these songs are really short, almost with a punk grindcore nature to them. But I felt like the vocals, in terms of how they move, in terms of how they move from one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum, really allow the tracks to have a slightly larger footprint. It allows the songs to feel a little bit bigger at times, and it helps connect the overall variety or diversity that exists from the first all the way to the last track. So vocally, this album was on point, perhaps one of the most consistent elements from start to finish, not just in terms of how it's delivered, but also the quality behind it. Now, obviously, this record is not going to win a Grammy, but that doesn't mean the album is not good. The album has quality in it. It all depends on how you perceive that quality, or it depends on how you look, or what do you look for in a record like this. If you're looking for a brutal death metal album that at times could feel sloppy, this album definitely has that. And I don't mean sloppy in terms of how it's played, but sloppy in terms of how the sound comes across and the production behind that sound. If that's what you're looking for, if that's the specific style and approach that you want, this album is definitely for you. If you're looking for a more defined or refined brutal death metal album, this record is going to completely feel short of that. So it all comes down to the listener, what your expectations are coming in, and what you want out of it. As far as favorite songs are concerned, I want to start off with Eucharist Intact. This is the second track. Technically the first track. I mean, the one before this is the intro. That track kind of bleeds into this one. The two almost become one. So this is technically the first track, even though on the track listing we'll say number 2 in front of it. Now, all the cards are on the table with this song. You're going to get a feel for the vocals throughout the entire record out of this track. You're going to get a feel for the sound, the nuances within the sound, and that experience that comes from that rugged production. Everything that this album is all about is incorporated in this single track. So it's perfect to get it started this way, because there's not going to be any surprises afterwards. Things may move around a little bit. You may have ups and downs, ebbs and flows. All of that is going to be there. But the meat and bones of how this album moves, how this album is created, is perfectly represented in the brutality, in the heaviness, and the dirty, grinding sound that this track offers, musically and vocally. Next, you have Pain Tolerance, a more grinding song. This track almost feels like you're sinking into it. It has heaviness, it has power, but it's not necessarily propelling you forward. It's rather moving very slowly, extremely slowly, and because of that, you feel that heaviness even more. It becomes very methodic in its approaches, and this applies to the sound and to the vocals. Everything is moving at one speed, and that speed is barely moving you along. There are still some ebbs and flows throughout the track, not enough to really create a drastic change or to really make this song feel more chaotic. This is a very cohesive, very balanced song that stays within its boundaries from start all the way to the end. Last but not least, Severely Wounded. The guitars are my favorite on this song throughout the entire record. I love the chunkiness. I love some of the dirt, almost feedback that you get at times from them. Once again, the production comes in and to create that experience. But I love it on this track. It sounds really cool. I love the experience, I love the sound, I love how it moves. Like I said, that chunkiness on the guitars becomes the main staple of how you're going to perceive this song. And then when you add the drums to it and how they add to that chunkiness of sound, it makes it feel complete. It really feels larger than life. It feels powerful. You don't have to have a great tempo to feel like a track is coming at you. This song moves not slowly, but it still moves at a nice pace, but it feels a lot faster. It feels a lot more powerful because of the sound of those guitars, how chunky they are, and how well they pair up with the drums. The vocals bring everything together. The vocals create some movement, and definitely the vocals stretch out this song ever so slightly, giving it in, playing into that role of making the track feel a lot bigger. This is it. Vomit Forth, Seething Malevolence, out July 8th on Century Media Records. Let me know your thoughts on the band. Use the comment section below. I'll be reading those and getting back to you. Take care, guys.